We're now being recorded. And hopefully the agenda is being displayed for your delight. Watson Ladd has agreed to take some notes for us, which is great. Thanks, Watson. And I asked Watson not to take verbatim notes, but just to note any actions. And feel free to help him in the Etherpad with notes as well, at the bottom. Okay, so it's 3 minutes past. So like I say, we don't have a Jabber room because we're not an IETF working group. We're an IAB program, which is a little bit different. But we can use the WebEx chat and the Etherpad. Etherpad is for notes, so don't mess it up too much, and maybe use the WebEx chat for any chit chat. I don't know if we'll need to run a mic line or not. If it starts to get confusing as to who wants to talk, then we can use the +Q -Q convention that IETF working groups are using for remote access meetings. So feel free to use that convention if you want to come in. So I'm just looking at the agenda, which I hope is being displayed on your screens. And is there any agenda bashing?
You are not screen sharing.
Oh, okay. Let me try and screen share. Oh, I guess when I hit the recording, it turns off. Yeah, that's great, isn't it? Okay, so there's screen sharing should reappear in a second. Great. Okay, so now you should be able to see the agenda. And now is a good time to bash the agenda if you need to. I think we have a 2-hour slot, but I hope we don't take 2 hours. So maybe an hour-ish, but we'll see. Okay, so any agenda bash? We basically have a bunch of chats about the drafts and then some planning. If there is no agenda bashing, just to check then, Mark is here, I see. Do we have Dominique? I presume it's Dominique to talk to the other 2 drafts in the middle?
Yep, I'm here.
Excellent, and I presume you'd like to chat about them, so that's good. And I think Yari's going to cover ours at the end, which should be kind of brief because not much has happened. And with that, and with no agenda bashing, I'll switch over to some slides that Mark had prepared. So 1 second while I swap. The right one. Okay, Mark. Look, if you just, whenever you want me to go to the next slide, just tell me to do that.
Okay, well, let's try it now. Perfect. So I promise this will be short. And I'm sorry I added 6 slides to the otherwise lightweight session here. This is kind of informational. This is a draft that attempts to identify classes of endpoints. That's the idea behind it. Primarily, the idea is it's part of another effort that's going on to basically establish the capabilities and limitations of endpoint-only security. That's the idea of the larger effort. This particular piece of work is an attempt to actually classify endpoint types, and the idea behind it is that if you could classify endpoint types, then you might actually be able to give guidance, and if you could maybe specify the security characteristics of particular endpoint types, you might be able to give guidance to protocol designers about what considerations should be given for adapting protocols for those particular endpoint types. Now, the idea behind this is that the intuitive idea is that the endpoint environment has changed since 2003. And so what we see in RFC 3552 has probably changed. And if that's true, and we could classify the endpoints, what I wondered before I wrote this draft, and as I was writing this draft, is could we go ahead and classify those endpoints? And if we were able to classify them, could we talk about their security characteristics, right? So next slide. So my metric for whether or not this kind of work would be useful is that if you could actually do a classification of endpoint types, and then you could talk about in some granularity what the security characteristics of those endpoint types would be, then maybe what you could do are these two things here. Some research could be done on those security characteristics and influence protocol design. That's number one. And number two, if that were true, it might be something that helped us in Model T reconsider the landscape that's documented in 3552. So next slide. Perfect. So the first draft of this document, which I did not bring to Model T, I brought it to the work that was going on in SMART and in CLES. The first document was entirely flat in that it was a taxonomy that divided endpoint types into 8 different classes and then attempted to describe those classes. And I'll talk about that in a second. One of the suggestions we got is to go ahead and provide a hierarchy so that the endpoint classes were a little bit deeper than a very high level characteristic. The current draft doesn't do that. I took that as advice, but I think that there's some danger in doing a highly granular taxonomy here. What we're trying to do instead is to provide an upper level characteristics sort of delineation so that protocol designers can understand security characteristics of larger groups of endpoint devices, right? And so I took the advice that a hierarchy might be useful, but I didn't act upon it. So that's one of the changes that's in the current draft. Next slide. For each one of the groupings, there's a description of what the endpoint grouping is like, and a description of its, and fundamentally a description of that class of endpoints. And then for each class, there are 7 things that are described for that class. So what we think of as commonalities for each class of endpoint device. And you can see them on the screen here. I won't read them, but they're things that are, I think, pretty straightforward. And so what happens in this environment is that for each one of the particular classes, you get a description of the class, and then these features, these characteristics of each one of those classes. Next slide. So the goal of the draft is purely informative. There's no normative language in it at all. And the reason I brought it to Model T was because I do think it's informative to Model T. I think part of our work in reconsidering 3552 is reconsidering the threat landscape, and part of reconsidering the threat landscape is reconsidering sort of the endpoint architecture that we currently support, both on public and private internets. So it's informative. There's no real intent here to provide any normative text at all. And one of the goals is to try to show that such a taxonomy is possible. That's one of the goals, because if it is, I think it's my intuition anyway, that that would show that the description of the threat landscape that's currently in RFC 3552 certainly needs to be updated. And that's a conversation that is just one part of what's going on with Model T. So maybe I'll take you to the next slide. So the future for the draft, I bring it here just to, first of all, to get more comments on it. And then second of all, to inform the conversation that we're having here in Model T about what to do next here, about describing the threat landscape. This is just one small part of it, a part that I'm interested in, but it is one small part of it because we're talking about endpoints here entirely. I will go back and reconsider the idea of doing a hierarchy instead of a taxonomy, although I'm reluctant to go down that path. And then, of course, further discussion inside of Model T whether or not this is actually useful for the discussion. One of the goals here is not related to Model T at all, but to combine this work with other work that's going on in class. And I promised I would be short, but my next slide is how I get out of here. So there's the draft, my email address. I'm thrilled to take questions and comments, and I'll just wait for that. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Mark. So again, if you want to jump in the mic line, then just put in a +Q in the WebEx chat. And we have Karsten at the head of the line.
Thank you. So skimming through this draft, I noticed that the classes you have in this taxonomy actually describe the role that endpoints play, the interactions they have with their digital and their physical or human environment. And you seem to infer the characteristics of the endpoints from the characteristics that an endpoint for one of these roles should have. And actually, I've been trying to work on something similar but different, which is revisiting RFC 7228, where we try to come up with some of those actual characteristics of the devices themselves. So I'm not saying that these two pieces of work need to relate to each other, but I see two approaches that may be somewhat complementary.
So thanks, Karsten, and I'd be very happy to talk offline about whether it's possible to combine the work. I actually would kind of welcome that. One of the things that you said first was that part of my descriptions of the classes is to talk about the roles of the endpoints, and I wrestled with that, to be honest, because I think that the classes should be as generic as possible, and that anything where you describe roles should just be as examples. They shouldn't help define the classes, if that makes any sense. So I appreciate that comment, and a to-do for me is just to talk to you offline about whether or not we can combine this work with 7228. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks. Dominique, I think you're next in the queue. And Arno, I have added you to the queue after Yari. So Dominique.
Okay, great. Thank you. Hey, Mark, thanks a lot for the presentation and the draft, which I've read a couple of times. Just a quick question. You have another draft, smart threat changes, a problem statement. I was just wondering how that fit into this work and sort of how you see the two going together. Thanks.
Yeah, I do have another draft that is talking about the threat landscape. It's sort of a response to Yari and Stephen's draft. And when we had our last virtual interim meeting, when the Vancouver meeting was canceled, it was for me an opportunity to sort of think about people who said, look, the threat landscape hasn't changed that much in the time since 3552 was written, and it only needs minor tweaks. And I kind of thought about that and thought, gee, that doesn't seem right to me. That it seems like there have been major changes to both the architecture and the endpoints that are supported in the public internet. So that draft is a response in many ways to some of the discussions. The idea behind it is really for it to be part of the conversation going forward in Model T. It really is orthogonal to the endpoints draft.
Okay, great. Thanks. We can probably talk about it a bit more later after all the drafts. Cool. Thanks.
And then I have Yari, then Arno, then Christian, and then Watson. So Yari.
Yeah, so thank you, Mark. This is quite interesting. I often think about things from the point of view, like how can I use this information? And I have a question about that in the case of your categories also. Like the phone that's on my table is probably all of the categories that you listed in the draft. And you know, how am I, so a protocol designer, going to take into account the different roles or the categories? And one possible answer perhaps is that you're going to focus on like this application endpoint, that we're going to make it very clear that the application endpoint is sort of standing on its own, and it has nothing to do with the other stuff on my phone, for instance. And that's the sort of the thinking that becomes clearer for us, and therefore we can easier design things. Is that what you were thinking of, or something else?
Part of that, thanks, Jari. Part of that is true. One of my thoughts when I was looking at devices, endpoints that sort of wash over multiple categories, if you will, would be easily understood to be in multiple categories, is that if the work is useful, one of the things we're doing here is identifying the security characteristics of each particular class. And if I had high hopes and was extremely optimistic, part of what would go on here is you would describe the security characteristics of each class in such a way that it helped protocol designers address security considerations for that class of devices. For a device that actually could be in multiple classes, like your phone on the table, then what we would be giving protocol designers is not just one set of security considerations, but multiple things to take into account as they design protocols. And so that's what I had in back of my mind, and how those thoughts link up. Certainly your remark about the application endpoints is exactly right, and I don't disagree with that. But to answer your first sort of question, I would say that one of my goals here, if I was very optimistic, was to provide security considerations that protocol designers could put together if they were targeting devices that fit in multiple categories. I wonder if that's clear.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Arno, I think you're next.
Yes, can you hear me?
Perfectly, thank you.
Yeah, okay. Hi, Steve. Yes, so it's more of a comment here. So unfortunately, I had a difficult life since Montreal, so I could only restart to work on class recently. But in fact, the origin of Mark's job is when class started, and we started to list and organize the limitations and capabilities of endpoint security solutions. We started to realize that we were completely missing a proper model of endpoints. So what I realized when I did this section in class, I had to really limit myself to the minimum. But it is a problem, because later in class itself, not what Mark has done now, but in class itself, the problem is that there is no uniformity to describe the type of attack. So in fact, it's not only that we are missing a model for endpoints, which Mark has started, but we are missing a model on threats, on attacks themselves. So the idea is that when we started that with Mark, in fact, Mark approached me at that time saying, Arno, what if we would organize a categorization of endpoint so that then it would make my life much easier and much better, more powerful and more clear in class itself. And in fact, I started to experiment a little bit in the version 2, because I was missing time, how to join the dots between class and what Mark has done. And we had a call 10 days ago, because I was in holidays last week, at home, of course. And we started to see that we could see how I could systematically inform Mark about what is the gap towards my document. So let's say if we have done a good job, what Mark has done, I should eliminate some text and make it much more uniform in class itself. That's one part. What will be then missing is the attack landscape document that was supposed to be started by another person, but it started to be slow. So the idea is class itself would be the joint between Mark's document and other document to be defined, so that we make class lighter and clearer, so that it's and more uniform. So perhaps we can start to find new abstraction layers. We can find perhaps a way to describe in a more uniform manner the characteristics of the endpoints, whether they are on the left side or right side of the communication. So I think we believe with Mark there is a very good potential for this situation in this way, so that we can then be more equipped with perhaps better descriptors for the future, for example, for what you guys are trying to do with Model T. I stop here. Thank you.
I don't know if Mark has a response to that, but if yeah, go ahead.
That seemed more like commentary on the future of class here, so I'll just let that stand.
Okay, and we have Watson and as the end of the queue for now.
So I just have a quick question about sort of terminological clarification. I'm hearing a lot of discussion about threat landscape, but that seems different from a threat model. A threat model is about what can an attacker do. And it seems that if we're going to talk about a threat landscape, that's what attackers like to do. And so I think there might be a gap here between sort of imagining how we talk about the threats and what we actually need to design protocols or bust to threats that we haven't necessarily thought about. I mean, if you look at RFC, at the RFC we're thinking about replacing, that's what it does. It's entirely about everything that can be done.
I think that's a really helpful remark. I think being careful to distinguish those two is essential, not just for a draft like this, but for all of our conversations in Model T. So I really appreciate that remark. I think that's really helpful.
And in the unhelpful way, I actually skipped Christian, who was in the queue before Watson. So apologies, Christian, and you're up now.
Yeah, I have reservation about classifications because pretty much every classification exercise ends up finding that we have a continuum, and basically you end up picking points in the continuum, and I'm not too sure that this is overly productive. And specifically, there's always a temptation, because it is a continuum, to go to a very large number of points, and then it becomes non-usable. More interestingly for me is that there are a couple of big questions, like on the device, which is effectively, can the software be updated, and by whom, and who can install software on the device? And basically, these are more about the management of the device than about the size of the software. But I think that the management is kind of as important as whether your device has 640K of memory or 64 megabytes. It's in my mind more important, especially for the threat model. We have seen threat model with new devices that are based on the fact that there is no clear definition of who manages them. For example, importing devices in your home network that end up being a surveillance point for a surveillance operation, or having device in an enterprise network that end up being like this classic problem of the casino in Vegas being attacked because someone was able to attack the management device that was managing the aquariums in the lounges. So I am more interested in this business of management and scope of control than the actual complete topology of devices. And I think that topology is a bit of a never-ending effort there.
Thanks, Christian. So it seems to me there were two threads there to your thought. The early thread was the thought that any categorization faces the problem that this is really a continuum of devices and capabilities. Yes, I agree with that, right? What I was attempting to do was not deny that there's a continuum, but instead to put possibly arbitrary groupings. If you imagine a continuum, what I'm trying to do here is to provide kind of arbitrary slices of that continuum and give them descriptions and provide characteristics. So while I recognize that it is a continuum, and I was not hopeless about the fact that you could possibly divide the continuum up into distinct segments. That much said, the second stream of what you said, that you were very interested in the management of classes of devices, rings really true to me. And I think that that would really improve a subsequent draft, is that for each classification, recognizing that you're skeptical that we'll ever get the classifications right. But if I were optimistic and I said that in a future draft, for each one of these classifications, as part of the description of the characteristics of those classes, we also described their managed, how the devices were managed and what their management capabilities were. I think that that's a very useful suggestion, and I will definitely take that on.
Okay, Mark. So I don't know, Christian, do you want to come back or?
No, that's fine. Thank you.
So we don't actually have anybody in the queue unless I've forgotten somebody else, in which case my apologies in advance. Meanwhile, in case people want to join the queue, Mark, did you have any kind of, when is a good time for people to read this draft and send comments to the list? Is it on the current one, or wait for another revision, or roughly when abouts might that happen, do you think?
Well, so let me answer your question a slightly obtuse way here. From the discussion here, I took that I've got sort of two to-dos, so our note taker has something concrete to work with. One of them is I will work with Karsten offline to see whether or not this work could fit together with 7228. I think that was a really good suggestion. And then from Yari, Watson, and Christian, I got really good suggestions for how the draft could be improved. And I would say that what I will try to do is get a new draft of this document out sometime in May, perhaps by the middle of May. And then I'd appreciate, and I will, put it on the Model T mailing list, and then look forward to further comments. How does that sound?
That sounds great, and hopefully by the middle of May, maybe we'll all be more free than we are now. So we'll get nicer comments even.
All right, thanks.
Okay, so again, nobody else seems to have joined the queue. I'm guessing we may be okay to move on to the next agenda item. And Dominique, that's you. You have two drafts. I didn't put them in any particular order. If you want to take them as one thing or two things, that's entirely whatever you're happy with. So.
I think I'm going to take them as two things because one sort of alludes to the other. So, so thanks for having the call, and great to see quite a few people on the call. And I'm going to talk about my two drafts. The first one is an update to an older draft, and I renamed it. So it's called a user-focused internet threat model. I don't have slides because I thought I would completely try to keep it simple. In any case, so the first draft that I'm talking about is basically an update, and it is user-focused, and it looks at sort of, it's the reason behind reconsidering threat modeling and reconsidering sort of an update to RFC 3552. It's user-focused, and in this update, it also takes on a couple of new, I put in new data breaches, but if you read through it, you'll also see that there's still a bit of work to be done, and I want to put an attack model into it and various other things like that. It also points out some other endpoint vulnerabilities, but again, it's not a massive update to the last one that I presented last year, actually. So under point 6 in that draft, there's a TBD about protocol designs, and instead of kind of filling that out, I decided to put in a new draft, which is the next one that we're talking about. Let me just pull it up, which is a security considerations for protocol designers. This is a much longer draft, and it's also a first draft, so there's still a lot of sort of things that need to be filled out. However, the point of this one in particular looks at considerations for protocol designers, focuses on attack defense. It classifies the types of attacks in the first part, and it looks at defensive measures and security considerations in the second part. I try to also fill it out in terms of case studies and examples, which I do need a lot more help in, and I do need to fill out a bit more. But basically, just to kind of highlight it a little bit, section 2 talks about the attacks. And again, I'll go through a number of different case studies that we probably all are quite familiar with. And section 3 looks at defensive measures. And again, I look at quite a lot of case studies that we've already seen. And I think under the defensive measures, there's still quite a few more that I'd like to add as well. And also, you know, based on what we've experienced in the last couple of weeks, in the last couple of months with the current pandemic going on, I think there's some really interesting case studies that can be added as well. So that's basically the overview. And hopefully some of you or a few of you have read it, but basically I'm just looking for feedback at this point on the first one, which again is a sort of second draft, very minimal, and then on the second one, which is this particular draft, and sort of ways forward and how this fits into the work. And I have some ideas, but I would really appreciate a lot of feedback at the moment, and I'm looking to update these two for July, which I think will probably be virtual, unfortunately. But yeah. So that's it. Very brief, and yeah, I look forward to discussing this.
Thanks, Dominique. If you want me to scroll to some particular part of a draft at any point in the Q&A type thing, then just say so. And great. In the queue, we have Watson and Yari. So Watson.
Thank you very much for writing a draft. I think it really highlights where you want to go with this. I'm just looking at the protocol design one. It seems to be like a lot of these threats are ones where, like take for instance, say SQL injection, right? This can be mitigated through software improvements. It's not a protocol issue per se. And then we're talking about, say, hijacking traffic with BGP hijacking and DNS problems. I mean, this is a consequence of the security model of BGP, but that's already identifiable as a problem if you look at the existing threat model and consider how BGP, fails to authenticate the data that's being sent in. So, looking at this, I'm just not really, it's not clear to me which of these threats require changes to the threat model for protocol designers to look at, or what those changes would be. I think you have specific problems, but if protocol designers can't mitigate them or can't change the protocol to be able to solve them, then that raises questions of what the update has to look like to enable that.
Cool. Thanks. Thanks so much for that. And I actually totally agree. What I was trying to do here, at least on the first draft, is that I was basically throwing everything in, to highlight the fact that these attacks do exist. And I totally take your point, because not all of them are specifically related to protocols. But I do think that at least on the initial first pass, some of the threats, we could be aware of them, right? Especially if it's sort of unintentionally the protocols are sort of contributing to it. So I think that's actually really good feedback for me, because again, I was trying to capture just everything and try to see if I can just sort of come up with a list, not necessarily a taxonomy, but come up with like a list of case studies for that. So I'll try to be more specific about effectively about the what are directly impact protocols and directly impact protocol design versus things that are probably perhaps more unintended consequences or have unintended results. So thank you for that.
Okay, so I have Yari and Wendy and then Eric. So Yari.
Thank you for this, Dominique. I think there's a really good list of attacks and good list of things to that we need to deal with in order to prevent some of these attacks. Maybe a depressingly long lists of both of them. Not sure it's entirely complete though. So, for instance, I think you're kind of missing some of the insider attacks. The second draft and structural programs like telling a participant more than you should. You do have insider threats, but it's more like in the social engineering type of sense than like a protocol node sense that I told this node too much and then the node was misbehaving for one reason or the other. Not this is just compromise, but just because it's incentives or its interests were different than mine. So maybe that's a thing that you could perhaps add. And also I think the list of remedies is more in the type of what can we do in the network than what can we do in the protocol design phase. And I think we could add a few things in the latter category as well. Otherwise, I like this.
Cool. Thanks. Yeah, I've noted both. So thank you very much.
Okay, and next up is Wendy, then Eric, then Christian, who I won't forget this time. So Wendy.
Yes, thank you for this draft. I'm looking at the security considerations for protocol designers. Wendy Seltzer here, and I think what strikes me as sort of it's a very good list for users of protocols and designers of systems that build on sort of the layered stack to be thinking of all of the ways that technology can be abused and subverted and used against them. I wonder, some of them look less amenable to being addressed in the protocol design and on a layered thinking of protocol design. You might even say some of them shouldn't be addressed in the design of a protocol that's seen as low level, but rather on applications above that. And so I wonder as the focus shifts toward responses or the what should people do once they've taken these things into consideration, whether you end up saying some of these are to be noted and then simply noted to higher levels or other users and implementers in the stack.
Okay. Let's see. Yeah, that's actually a really, really good point. So the first pass of this was just like breaking it down into two sections. I could actually almost from your comments see breaking it down into further sections based on the different layers. And it's actually really, I think that's really helpful. I can probably even do that in my next pass. So thank you for that. That's really, really useful.
Okay, so we have Eric and then Arno. So Eric. Eric's not audible.
Am I audible now? Maybe not.
Yes, yes, I hear you now.
I am good. Okay. So, I mean, 3552 was intended to serve two purposes, right? One to, I guess three. One to have some tutorial material on how to think about threat modeling. One about and about protocols. One to try to set a baseline kind of like expectation about what protocols should be like do. And third to describe how to write the security consideration section, which is what the document's actually nominally about. So, I mean, I guess, and one of the things we found when we started doing that was to actually write these example security considerations, and see how with the instructions we were giving people actually deliver the security considerations sessions we were hoping that they would have. So I guess my question here is, if one were to take these documents on board, how would this affect the security considerations or the design of protocols which you've already built?
Okay, so first of all, I think that basically, I think all of the documents, including yours that, or well, not yours, but Yari's, that's Yari and Stevens, that's coming up, right, that have different approaches. All of them should be included in the sense that like they highlight different aspects, right? So I think regardless of whether or not the protocol has already been built or is going forward, my feeling for the particular draft that I came up with is that it's just an awareness raising issue on, on awareness raising sort of thing on some of the issues. And as Wendy rightly pointed out, there are different issues depending on different layers, right? So I think that depending on, I think that going forward, all of this fits into one thing, right? Because they're different, because Yari and Steven actually basically highlight different approaches, right? And highlight different risks and highlight different threat models, which I totally think is actually completely useful in a different way than the sort of endpoint threat models and the different sort of aspects that I have in my draft. So maybe I'm too much thinking of it being as a broad church where everything needs to be addressed and looked at before we kind of think about updating it, but or how we're going to update it in the process. But that's sort of what I'm thinking.
I think I'm asking a different question, which is like the purpose of producing these documents is to give guidance to, or any document of this kind, is to give guidance to the people writing the RFCs, which we then describe the protocols which then implement. And so my question is, in what way would this document, I'm trying to understand what the impact of this document is, and so I'm trying to understand how, if we take some example documents which involve protocols we designed, how would the material in this document alter the protocols and or the security considerations in those documents?
Okay. So I think that the bottom line is that this is more up to date. I'm not even sure it will impact previous protocols, but I think it's more about going forward. I mean, don't you agree on that?
Well, I guess maybe, but I guess what I'm trying to understand, and so we could certainly take some protocols which are currently being developed, but I guess what I'm trying to understand is, but I mean, like, we have like plenty of protocols that were published like in the past 2 years, right? And so my question is, like, I guess, so as a, like, how would you want to change security considerations for Quick based on the material in this document, or TLS 1.3 or DOE? And so, like, I'm trying to understand that because I'm trying to understand whether I think that whether they think that there would be good changes or not.
Right. I'm not even sure that there are going to be many changes to that, right? I mean, unless they're like massive updates to like Quick or DOE or anything like that, because they're in a, I mean, that's what I'm trying to think. I'm trying to think about going forward from now, right? I don't know. Do we want to talk about this offline and maybe take specific
Well,
examples?
sure. Yeah, I guess I'm just trying to
That's
understand.
cool. No, that would be good.
Okay,
Yeah.
I guess I'm just trying to understand. I think this is like a good test for all these documents, right? Is like what would materially change about the work we do based on the material in this document? Because if the answer is nothing, then I don't really understand what we're doing.
Well, yeah, but we don't know what protocols are going to be developed in like 5 to 10 years, right? Like,
I think if we can't retrospectively go back and ask how we wish these documents were different, then we're like really, then it's like really understand what this exercise is doing. So.
Cool. Okay, cool. All right. We can actually have I think we should have thanks.
Okay, thanks. I think I have Arno, Christian, sorry, and then Arno. Christian?
Thanks, Dominic. I really like this idea of doing a list of attacks. I mean, I do understand what Eric is saying, that it's not directly actionable in terms of protocol design, but nevertheless, that's quite interesting. However, when I read your draft, there are 2 additional things that I would like to see in drafts like that. The first one is, what were the assets that the attacker were looking after? And the reason for looking at the assets is that the basic threat modeling starts with, what is it that you want to protect exactly? And it's often very, very fuzzy. But if we have a clear view of what attackers are after, then it becomes easier to say, okay, the weakness in this protocol may drive an attack against these or that kind of assets. To give examples, we have seen attacks in the past that were looking at, for example, getting a foothold in a protected network, which were basically typically trying to do phishing attacks and things like that. But the idea that you get something running inside the protected network and use that as a basis for further attack is something that we have to consider. The other kind of asset that we have seen are attacks on metadata. Several of the attacks in the past have been attacks trying to get listing about user IDs, listing about what people are doing, and access to databases, but there could be also access about what is the activity going on a particular network. And so I'd like in your description to see basically to get examples of those targeted attacks against specific assets. And finally, we have attacks about databases, about threat secrets and things like that. And we have also well-publicized attacks against basically just in order to drive extortion against the continuous operation of a business. Extortion attacks using either denial of service attacks or ransomware, which are kind of going to the same goal, but with different means. So, I mean, I'd like to see if you pursue that effort, you should really look at what kind of assets the attackers were after. And that would inform things about what I am going at next, which is the schema of those attacks. And what's very clear about all of those attacks is there's a cascading effect. Typically, the attackers in most of those attacks don't attack one system in isolation. Or one endpoint in isolation. They attack typically a system, a network, an enterprise, a school, something like that. And they go through a process of getting a foothold and then getting to data and things like that. So that gives us also the idea of basically one of the problem we have with our deployments is that we don't have defense in depth. And that will be, in my mind, to answer Eric's question, showing how the absence of defense in depth leads to catastrophic effects would be very interesting, because defense in depth, it's something that we can incorporate in protocol design at some level. So these are the two things that I'd like to see in this kind of evolution of the draft. One, looking at the assets that people would think about protecting, and the other one, looking at defense in depth or lack thereof, and what its effects are.
Great, thank you. So asset protection and defense in depth, and I think that could be accomplished by filling out some of the sections that are already there on data protection, but going a little more specifically on sort of what kind of data and sort of the characteristics of how that was breached. So thank you. That's really, really helpful.
Yeah, and by assets, it's not necessarily just that people are looking after the database of credit cards. It's look at, for example, this attack on this casino in Las Vegas that started by hacking the climate control system of the aquarium.
Yep. Okay.
Yep. And that's illuminating, because it tells you how a very benign system, like, I mean, who cares about the temperature control in an aquarium? I mean, yeah, you might lose some fishes, but what is the effort? And in fact, what that gives you is a foothold in someone's data network that can then be used to go further. So, I mean, we have to publicize these kind of things.
Yeah, great idea. Thank you.
So there's also, I think, some backing in the WebEx chat about thinking about assets. And I think we have Arno in the queue next.
Yes, thank you, Steve. So, in fact, I would like to continue from what Christian has said. So in fact, the issue of the asset is that the asset is very relative value. It really depends. So for example, right now, my phone has no interest for a hacker, but a phone that would be used by some other person in some other context would be very valuable for the attacker. And this leads back to the risk management, because this is a risk management issue, and this is defined already elsewhere in ISO and in IEC and in other places. So it's true, but at the same time, it's going to be very difficult to describe that in this draft, from my perspective. The point of the campaign is very good. I think the campaign, and this is why we need to have a way to describe atomic attacks, and that's perhaps part of the model versus the landscape. I think Watson. Campaign is actually an orchestration of the attack in a certain way, and the defense is an orchestration of the defense to fight a certain campaign. And we do not. The problem is that we do not have the Lego bricks of language to actually describe that. So now, when I look at this draft, for example, Dominic, phishing, for me, phishing is not an attack on a device. It's an attack on the brain, right? But you have other places where you have an attack on the device, and this links back to what Mark is trying to do, what I'm trying to do. So the issue we have now, coming back to the problem of how it, and what Eric said about how it speaks to the protocol designers, we do not have the mapping between these type of documents or what I do or what Mark is doing versus what is important for the protocol designer. We are missing some language here. And the language, what I would like to have with Mark, is a language that goes beyond the category to describe the attack surface problem. What is the attack surface? That's the attack surface that is coming from the asset, from what Christian has said. The problem then is we do not see the view. We need to distinguish the two things from the asset side versus the attack side. We really need to make this explicit distinction and reorganize the language on both sides to understand, okay, now we have a language to describe our vulnerabilities in terms of, yes, you can call it management, you can call it the way that the physical system is organized, blah, 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 on one side. And then you have the attack on the other side. And then you have the mitigation that is trying to answer the attack, that is trying to attack the attack surface. And we are just missing this language, first of all, to organize that better. So I think this is a gap that we have between at least the few drafts that we have seen so far. Stop here.
Great, thanks. Yeah, no, I completely understand what you're getting at with that. So I've made a note. Lots of great feedback overall. So thank you, Arno. We can talk about it a bit more too.
We can.
Okay, great. So I don't have anybody else in the queue at the moment. One little bit of housekeeping. We have a call-in user. If you could identify yourself, that would be just for the notes. That'd be great. It may be somebody who's in twice or something, but there's a call-in user 5. If you could let us know who you are, that'd be cool. And while that call-in user is unmuting or trying to. Okay, that was Eric. Okay, so Dominic, I think you kind of answered this at the beginning, but so your kind of plan is to maybe do a revision of this in a month or two, and you looking for more feedback on the current version in between now and then. Is that roughly correct, or?
Yes, yeah, and just to highlight, I got feedback from Watson, Wendy, EKR, Christian, and Arno, and also Randy and Mark in the chat as well, building a little bit more on Christian. So I will incorporate those comments, and I'll probably reach out to all of you on that. And also, you know, I'm happy and open to any collaboration. If there's any sections or any particular individual parts that people want to work on or add to, please please feel free. I'd be happy, more than happy for that. So yeah, thanks.
Great, thanks. And Okay, so I think we're on to Yari, and I'll swap over the slidey thing.
I think this will be relatively brief. So this is an update on the draft that me and Stephen wrote. And the slides were sent on the list. If you, Stephen, go to the second slide, that's the only content slide. So as you may remember, this draft essentially talks about like why do we need to go beyond ConSec, and about the details of that. And two things happened in the previous round of updates, draft updates. So first of all, we added material on web tracking, thanks to Eric and Chris, who submitted text. That's great. So this is under section 2.3, which is examples, and then section 4, areas requiring further study. I mean, we clearly know some things about web tracking, but maybe it's not an entirely exhaustive topic yet. So that's one thing. Feedback on the specifics of the text is always welcome, of course. And the other thing that we sort of reformulated in the draft was we started thinking about exactly what do we want to do for RFC 3552. And we basically offered 3 alternatives. And just for background, and this sort of ties into the previous discussion that we had with Eric and you all about like what's the output of this exercise. Are we changing 3552 and is there like one document or some small update or 4 documents, whatever. So my personal view, at least, that there's some sort of supporting documentation like Stephen's, and my draft is one example of that, but other drafts as well. And they could be published on their own. And I at least would have some interest in doing that for our draft. But in addition to that, there is this question of whether we should add a little bit to the existing RFC, and exactly what is that little bit. And we basically came up with 3 choices here. Like one is this essentially one sentence. It's simple but obvious. It's easy to add, but do we want to update the entire RFC for that one sentence? We could talk for the option 2 slightly more about the capabilities required for the attack to happen, or attacks to happen, and some analysis like what you need to do in order to defend against this. But still like two more paragraphs. Or we could provide a more comprehensive set of defense guidelines, still at the relatively high level, but this is like a new subsection in the document. And this is, again, by the way, text that was contributed by Eric and Chris, so thank you very much again. So here we would talk about things like how to limit time of exposure, making attackers have to use active attacks and so forth. And this could be one new subsection. It's not like a super comprehensive thing either. Like it could still fit in the document, I think, nicely. But it could also be a freestanding RFC and perhaps go into more depth. And I'm not particularly wedded to any of these options here. Looking for feedback from you guys. And that's more or less it. Stephen, do you want to add something?
No, I haven't actually looked at this for a while, so no. And also, I'm trying to be less opinionated this evening, and just be chair-like. So you're doing fine.
Right. So let's open it up for questions or comments.
So okay, so we don't have anybody in the queue right now. Wendy has offered to send some mail with some help, and a couple of people have had to leave at the top of the hour. So Watson.
So I looked over the draft. I think it's pretty good. One thing I'd like to add is there's discussion about sort of control. There's some discussion about sort of control plane things, but there isn't a lot about the way in which, say, you have a Kubernetes cluster, all your network access and policies, etc., are really kind of useless because everything goes over port 8 or port 443. And so you have a layer of authorization and authentication concerns, which are sort of above the HTTP layer. And so it's very easy to make mistakes where you have, say, proxy and all of a sudden everything is completely terrible. And that's a threat that hasn't been considered before, and I think should be added.
Okay, that sounds interesting and quite valid thing. I guess I at least had my protocol engineer head on when I was thinking about this topic earlier, but you raise a valid point, so we could talk about that too. Thank you.
Christian?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very concrete draft that you two have been preparing, but I'm really worrying that we are missing the overarching surveillance is an attack draft. I mean, a lot of the practical attacks on, I mean, Dominic has been looking at the big attacks, the one that go against the breaches and the advanced threats and things like that. But there is this permanent low-level threat of surveying people and surveillance and using, say, either the advertisement model in the web or various devices, buying a thermostat and having it survey the inhabitant of the house and things like that. And I don't know whether we should have an effort there similar to the pervasive monitoring is an attack effort.
Yeah, I'm kind of wondering, like, how do we, did we miss that? Or, I mean, did you, I think we talk about that, but maybe it's not as prominent and it's not in blinking red letters. We can think about making it better. Maybe that's a thing for you and I to discuss as well and figure out.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be happy to discuss that, but basically we have to raise this, hey, you have to defend against surveillance the same level as you have to defend against monitoring. And the way to do that is to make that prominent.
Okay.
Okay, so Ted?
Thanks. I guess the short thing is if you and Christian are going to chat about this, I'd be interested in being part of the chat as well. But I think the longer thing is I've become increasingly convinced that we actually have more than one category here that we've been lumping into surveillance, and that the defenses against the different categories are substantially different. And as a result of that, we may want to actually make clear that the way we were thinking about pervasive surveillance or the way we're thinking about the defenses against pervasive surveillance probably don't actually map all that well into the advertising model concerns that Christian is chatting about. So I think we may actually want to see if there's some way of breaking apart that that category in ways that would make building the defenses a little bit more obvious.
I think that's a really good suggestion, actually. And maybe Mark could expand his draft to categorize all these different surveillance devices and applications that we have. But yeah, more seriously, I think this is a thing that we should actually do. Thank you, Ted.
Okay. I agree that I think that's a good point as well, Ted, is another. So I don't have anybody else in the queue unless I'm messing up again, which is quite possible. If not, I guess, Yari, when do you plan to update the draft?
So I guess the new feedback that we just received, notwithstanding, before that I was feeling like we're pretty ready. I think the new information needs to go in, but we can probably do that by early May. And then my plan was that I would like to sort of shift mode a little bit, like instead of add more stuff to the draft, start readying it to something that's sort of well scoped and publishable. maybe cut some pieces away from it and put it elsewhere, like separate the 3552 updates and the rationale and so on. But it may basically that's when I'd like to do something.
Kind of works for me as well, so that's good. Okay, so I think we have nobody else in the queue. We've talked about drafts. The only other addendum is, I guess it might be worth spending just a couple of minutes on how would people like to proceed, given we're probably not going to Madrid. So I guess the obvious thing is to kind of have these kind of calls at some frequency. But what are people's thoughts? What would you like? And Mark?
Thanks. So I agree too. I'm pretty skeptical that we'll meet physically in Madrid, although there should be no counting on my crystal ball in any way. On the other hand, I'd like to see progress keep going there. And when I heard Jari sort of talk about getting a draft done in May, early May, mid-May, I would be committed to revising my work by that time. I think it would be great if the chairs scheduled another virtual session like this, trying to keep it to an hour again. I know that's hard, but try to do that sometime in mid to late May. That'd be my suggestion.
Okay, so that gets a +1 and nobody disagreeing. So yeah, and is there any particular cadence after that? Let's imagine between now and November-ish. Monthly is a suggestion from Randy. Any other suggestions, or should we try and schedule monthly? Okay, so
Stephen, can I add something?
Sure, please.
Yeah, so the call schedule is one thing. Maybe monthly is good, but I think we need to talk about, like, what's the project otherwise also, because I see that there's like potential to come out with some concrete things and actual RFCs in relatively soon if we scope them properly. But then there's also like more long-term, almost like permanent research projects that what's the current state of this or that. And it would be useful if you try and separate that. And a little bit that's part of the reason why I was saying that I would like to start splitting the drafts up a little bit. I don't know what other people think about this.
So there's some +1s, +1 from Watson to Jari, I think. Wendy has to leave. Yeah, maybe. So we having some meetings at a cadence of monthly-ish seems reasonable. We can set up some polls, pick times, and so on. Jari, maybe in terms of your, setting out a sketch of the future or something, maybe we can try and construct an email and send it to the list that is a bit more concrete on that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so then I guess that puts an action on Jari and I to try and craft a mail to send to the list, suggesting what we might aim for between now and November, as opposed to how often we'll meet, and also we'll cover how often we'll meet. Okay, any other planning type issues? I don't see anybody in the queue. I assume not, and if not, we're on to the any other business part of the agenda. So is anybody any other business? Lunch for some. Indeed, please add yourself to the participant list in the Etherpad, which is on screen there now. And if there's no other business other than lunch, enjoy your lunch. I hope everybody keeps well, and we'll talk on the list and have another chat like this in mid to end May. So thanks very much, and good evening, chaps.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.